Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. I am Francesco Santi, and I'm very happy to share with you a topic that is very close to my heart: the systemic effects of equilibriodontics. I like you to think of this as a journey, starting in the mouth, moving through the brain, and reaching the entire system. Let me start with a simple question. Is the mouth really just a mouth, or is it something more? This question does not come from theory. It came from my clinical experience. Because when I look back at my own professional journey, I realized that in the beginning I believed I was simply working on teeth and occlusion, and only gradually I began to understand that something much deeper was happening. More than 20 years ago, when I started using the activators, the ancestors of today's balancers, I had no real idea of what I was actually holding in my hands. At the time, I thought I was simply working on teeth and occlusion. Only gradually I realized that these devices were something much more powerful. They were, and still are, a unique gateway to systemic health. Because over time, something unexpected began to happen. Patients started telling me things I was not really looking for. They would say, I'm sleeping better. My breathing feels different. My neck feels lighter. I feel calmer. At first, I didn't know what to do with these observations. They were not part of what I thought I was treating, but they kept repeating themselves: different patients, different ages, same type of changes. And slowly, a question began to form. What if the mouth was not just a local structure? What if it was influencing something much deeper? That was the moment when my clinical perspective started to change, and that is the journey I would like to share with you tonight. To make sense of what I was observing, I needed a different image, something simple but powerful. This is why I like to describe equilibriodontics using the image of an iceberg, or better, an equiberg. What we see in the mouth when we use a balancer is just the tip of the equiberg. That's the visible part: teeth, occlusion, tongue posture, oral functions. But the largest and most important part lies below the surface, and that submerged part involves the entire organism: posture, breathing, sleep, stress regulation, emotional balance. Very often in clinical practice, we focus almost exclusively on what we can see. But what really matters is what we don't immediately see. Equilibriodontics works precisely at this level. By acting on oral functions, it influences deep regulatory mechanisms. So the mouth becomes the entry point not just for local changes, but for systemic reorganization. Now, the question is no longer whether the mouth influences the rest of the body. The real question becomes: how does this influence actually happen? To answer this question, we need to move beyond the tooth. Equilibriodontics invites us to look beyond the tooth. The focus is not primarily about alignment, it's about functions: breathing, swallowing, chewing. When functions improve, the system organizes itself and form follows. Through the adequate execution of functions, the craniofacial shape is naturally sculpted. And this is where the mouth becomes a powerful interface between the nervous system and the rest of the body. When we focus on functions rather than form, the mouth stops being a local structure. It becomes part of a much larger system. One mouth, many pathways. When we look at the mouth through the lens of functions, it becomes clear that its influence does not stop locally. When oral functions improve, systemic health improves as well. One mouth, many pathways: postural, endocrine, metabolic, neurological. Oral functions continuously interact with posture, with breathing mechanics, with metabolic regulation, and with the endocrine system. But above all, they interact with the nervous system. This is why changes in oral functions can sometimes lead to effects that seem disproportionate to what we see in the mouth. Because what is being modulated is not a tooth but a regulatory network. When we think about regulation, we usually look upward to the cortex, to higher brain centers. But very often, regulation begins much lower in the brainstem, in sensory gateway. From a neurological perspective, the mouth is not peripheral at all. It is one of the most important sensory organs of the human body. In terms of receptor density, the stomatognatic system ranks second, surpassed only by the ends. Both the mouth and the ends have a very large representation in the cerebral cortex, and interestingly, the cortical representation of the mouth is located even more anteriorly than the one of the end. This organization is not accidental. It reflects the crucial role of the mouth in sensory input, motor control, and regulation. Every contact between the tongue and the palate, every dental contact, every swallow, every breath through the nose is continuously informing the nervous system. So, when we intervene in the oral cavity, we are never acting locally. We are interacting with central regulatory networks. If the mouth has such a central sensory and regulatory role, then dentistry cannot be limited to a purely mechanical or local approach. If the mouth is such a central sensory interface, then there is an important consequence we cannot ignore. Every intervention we perform in the oral cavity inevitably interacts with the nervous system, whether we are aware of it or not. Every change in occlusion, every modification of tongue posture, every alteration of breathing patterns sends new information to the brain, and the nervous system responds to this information. This means that dentistry is never neutral. It can support regulation or it can increase dysregulation. Understanding this does not make our work more complicated. It makes it more conscious. And it opens the door to a different way of thinking about therapy, not just as a mechanical correction, but as a form of neurosensory modulation. Michel Clossard once expressed this idea in a very clear and direct way. He said, "A dentist must be a neurologist." At first, this may sound exaggerated, but when we consider the brain-oral axis and the central role of the trigeminal nerve, this statement becomes surprisingly accurate. In my daily clinical practice, I see this very clearly. When I explain to my patients, of course in a simplified way, the neurological implications of equilibriodontics, they are usually amazed. They suddenly realize that we are not just working on teeth. And very often, they become enthusiastic about starting a therapy that can have such deep and global effects. This is the shift we are talking about from dentistry as a local mechanical intervention to dentistry as a form of neurosensory regulation. So, if dentistry inevitably interacts with the nervous system, we need a model to understand how this interaction actually takes place. This interaction is not abstract. It follows very precise anatomical and functional pathways. There is a continuous dialogue between the mouth and the brain. This dialogue is what we call the brain oral axis. The brain oral axis describes a continuous bidirectional communication between the mouth and the nervous system. The mouth is not just a passive receiver of commands. It is an active sensory organ that constantly sends information to the brain. This information travels through well-defined neural pathways and reaches the brainstem, where fundamental regulatory processes take place. At the same time, the brain continuously modulates oral functions, influencing muscle tone, coordination, and motor patterns. So, what we have is not a linear pathway, but a dynamic loop. A loop in which structure and function, periphery and center constantly influence each other. Understanding this axis allows us to move beyond a purely local interpretation of oral therapies. It helps us see equilibriodontics as an intervention that acts within a broader regulatory network. Within this continuous dialogue between the mouth and the brain, not all structures play the same role. Some pathways are particularly influential in shaping regulation, stress response, and systemic balance. If we want to understand the systemic effects of equilibriodontics, we need to focus on two key players, the trigeminal nerve and the locus coeruleus. The trigeminal nerve brings continuous sensory information from the mouth and the face directly to the brainstem. The locus coeruleus is a small nucleus in the brainstem, but has a very powerful influence. The trigeminal nerve tells the brain what is happening at the periphery. The locus coeruleus helps the brain decide how strongly it should react. Together, these two systems shape alertness, stress response, autonomic balance, and the internal tone of the nervous system. This is why they are so important for understanding the systemic effects of equilibriodontics. To understand this interaction more deeply, we need to look at these two players one at a time. And it makes sense to start with the one that brings information into the system, the trigeminal nerve. The trigeminal nerve is usually associated with pain, but pain is only one of its many languages, not the only one. And tonight we will unravel its mysteries. The trigeminal nerve collects sensory information from the mouth, the entire face, but also from the whole organism. But what makes the trigeminal nerve truly unique is not only what it innervates, but where this information goes. Trigeminal afferents project directly to the brainstem, to areas involved in breathing, autonomic regulation, hormonal balance, and stress response. So, the trigeminal nerve is not just a sensory nerve, it is a gateway through which oral function can influence the nervous system as a whole. The trigeminal nerve acts as a functional bridge, a bridge between the mouth and the brain, and through the brain, a bridge towards the autonomic and endocrine systems. What happens in the mouth does not stop locally. It does not stop at sensation. It becomes regulation. Every contact, every swallow, every chewing cycle, every mandibular tension is translated into signals that reach deep regulatory centers. Because this system is always active, day and night. So the trigeminal nerve is not just carrying information, it is continuously shaping the internal environment of the nervous system. And this is a key point. If the trigeminal nerve acts as a functional bridge, then the mouth cannot be considered a secondary or peripheral structure. It becomes a central player in systemic regulation. The trigeminal nerve does not simply transmit information, it regulates. It acts as a bridge between what happens in the periphery and how the body responds systemically. Through its brainstem connections, the trigeminal system influences autonomic balance, stress regulation, hormonal rhythms, and circadian organization. So, trigeminal input does not stay at the level of sensation. It shapes the internal environment in which the nervous system operates. When trigeminal stimulation is physiological, the signals reaching the brain are coherent, organized, and supportive of regulation. When the stimulation is dysfunctional, the signal becomes noisy, irritating, and stress-inducing, and the nervous system reacts accordingly. This is why the trigeminal nerve really matters. It continuously modulates the tone of the entire system. For the nervous system, information is never neutral. What really matters is not only how much stimulation arises, but how that stimulation is organized. A physiological oral function generates a signal that is coherent, rhythmic, and well organized. The nervous system recognizes this type of signal as meaningful and supportive. A dysfunctional oral function, on the other hand, generates a signal that is fragmented, irregular, and chaotic. The nervous system interprets this signal as stress. So, the issue is not stimulation itself, but signal quality. Order supports regulation. Chaos amplifies dysregulation. And this distinction is fundamental for understanding why small changes in oral functions can have such wide systemic effects. So the next question becomes very practical. Where does this signal quality come from in everyday life? What is the most frequent, most repetitive, and most underestimated source of trigeminal stimulation? It is swallowing. We swallow about 2,500 times every day. This means swallowing is not an occasional event, it is a constant neurological stimulus. Every single swallow activates the trigeminal system. Every single swallow sends information to the brainstem. And because it happens so frequently, the quality of this stimulation has a cumulative effect. Every functional swallow sends three distinct signals to the trigeminal nerve. First, the tongue presses against the palatal spot, stimulating the trigeminal nerve through the nasopalatine nerve. 2. The teeth come into occlusion, stimulating the trigeminal nerve through the periodontal receptors. 3. The masseter muscles contract, activating the neuromuscular spindles which send afferent signals to the trigeminal nerve. In physiological swallowing, the signal is organized, symmetrical, and coherent. In dysfunctional swallowing, the signal becomes irregular, asymmetrical, and stressful for the nervous system. So, swallowing becomes a form of daily neurological training, a training that can either support regulation or continuously reinforce dysregulation. If swallowing represents such a powerful and repetitive source of stimulation, then every small dysfunctions can have a significant impact over time. This is why even small changing in swallowing patterns can lead to significant systemic effects. The good news is that this signal can be re-educated by restoring symmetry, rhythm, and functional coherence. This is where the balancer comes into play. The balancer is not just a mechanical device. Its real function is neurological. By guiding the tongue toward a physiological position, by balancing occlusal contact, and by supporting nasal breathing, the balancer helps reorganize the quality of trigeminal input. Instead of fragmented or asymmetrical stimulation, the nervous system begins to receive a more coherent and rhythmic signal. This does not force the systems, it informs it. And when information becomes clearer, regulation becomes possible. In this sense, the balancer acts upstream, not on symptoms, but on the signal that shapes regulation. This is why its effects extend far beyond the oral cavity. If the balancer re-educates the quality of trigeminal input, the next question is, where does this reorganized signal actually arrive? Which structure in the brain receives this information and translates it into changes in alertness, stress, and regulation? This brings us to the locus ceruleus. The locus ceruleus is a very small nucleus located in the brainstem. Despite its size, it plays an extremely large role. It produces the majority of noradrenaline in the central nervous system and acts as a key regulator of alertness, attention, stress response, and autonomic balance. When the locus ceruleus is well regulated, it supports focus when needed and allows recovery when it is time to rest. Its activity is naturally low during sleep, moderate during calm wakefulness, and higher during moments of challenge or demand. In other words, it is a fine regulator, not an on-off switch. And what makes the locus ceruleus particularly relevant for us is its close anatomical and functional relationship with the trigeminal system. This means that sensory input from the mouth can directly influence the level of alertness of the entire brain. As long as the locus ceruleus remains finely regulated, the system is able to adapt. But problems arise when this regulation is lost. When the locus ceruleus is kept in a state of persistent activation, the brain never truly switches off. This is what happens when alert becomes excessive. When the locus ceruleus remains chronically overactivated, the nervous system loses its ability to down-regulate. The brain stays in a state of continuous alert, even when there is no real external threat. This has a very concrete consequence. Sleep becomes shallow or fragmented. Recovery is incomplete. Fatigue accumulates. At the same time, the autonomic balance shifts. Sympathetic tone increases. Parasympathetic activity decreases. The organism remains in a state of readiness that was meant to be temporary, but becomes chronic. It is important to underline one point. This is not a psychological issue. It is a neurobiological condition. The nervous system is reacting coherently to the information it receives. And when that information is distorted or excessive, the state of alert becomes excessive as well. When the brain remains in a state of excessive alert, one of the first systems to be affected is rhythmic regulation. The balance between activation and recovery, between day and night, between stress and repair. This balance is not random. It is regulated by a precise neurobiological axis, an axis that connects the trigeminal system, the locus ceruleus, and the pineal gland. Now we can connect all the elements together. There is a real functional axis between the trigeminal nerve, the locus ceruleus, and the pineal gland. Sensory inputs from the mouth reach the trigeminal system. The trigeminal system modulates the activity of the locus ceruleus. The locus ceruleus sends noradrenergic projection to the pineal gland. This pathway is essential for regulation of melatonin synthesis, circadian rhythm, and neuroendocrine balance. When this axis is disturbed, we see inflammation, pain, fatigue, hormonal imbalance. Once again, the mouth does not act locally. It acts within a deep regulatory network. Within this axis, there is one molecule that plays a particularly important role. A molecule that translates neural rhythm into biological time. It is often associated only with sleep, but its role is far more extensive. This molecule is melatonin. Melatonin, produced in the pineal gland, is not only the hormone of sleep, it is a key regulator of biological rhythm. It synchronizes internal processes with the alternation between day and night. Melatonin acts as a powerful antioxidant, a modulator of inflammation, and an epigenetic regulator, influencing immune balance and tissue repair. This means that altered melatonin production does not only affect sleep, it affects how the body recovers, how it adapts to stress, and how it maintains structural and functional balance. Within the trigeminal locus ceruleus pineal axis, melatonin represents the final biological output, a signal that tells the organism now it's time to repair. When this signal is disrupted, the consequences can emerge in very different ways, from sleep disorders to postural imbalance and pain syndromes. And this is why melatonin becomes a key element in understanding conditions such as adolescent idiopathic scoliosis and migraine. When a regulator like melatonin is altered, its effects do not remain abstract. They become visible in the body. One of the conditions in which this dysregulation has been extensively studied is adolescent idiopathic scoliosis. And this is when the clinical relevance of this axis becomes particularly clear. Adolescent idiopathic scoliosis is a complex and multifactorial condition. Genetic factors, biomechanics, growth dynamics, and neuroendocrine regulation all seem to play a role. But one question remains open. Why does the spine lose its symmetrical regulation during growth? One of the most compelling hypotheses involves melatonin. Experimental models have shown that alteration in pineal function or melatonin signaling can lead to scoliotic deformities. Melatonin plays a crucial role in neuromuscular coordination, postural tone, and symmetrical muscle activity. If this rhythmic regulation is disturbed, the growing spine may gradually lose its balance, and the trigeminal rocus pineal axis offers a possible explanatory model. Altered oral function may contribute to dysregulate trigeminal input, which in turn affects the locus ceruleus and indirectly pineal signaling. This does not mean that mouse causes scoliosis, but it suggests that oral functions are one of the modulators of a system that governs postural symmetry. And this opens interesting perspectives for functional reeducation and integrative clinical approaches. When rhythmic regulation is altered, the body can express this imbalance in different ways. In some cases, the manifestation is postural, as in adolescent idiopathic scoliosis. In other cases, the same dysregulation emerges primarily as pain. And one of the clearest examples of this is migraine. Migraine is one of the most common neurological disorders worldwide. It is often described simply as a headache, but in reality, it is a complex disorder of regulation. At the core of migraine lies an abnormal activation of trigeminal afferents and altered pain modulation. This activation leads to the release of neuropeptides such as CGRP that promotes neurogenic inflammation and vascular dysregulation. But pain is only one part of the picture. Migraine is also strongly associated with sleep disturbances, altered circadian rhythm, and dysregulation of stress response. And once again, melatonin plays a central role. Many studies have shown that migraine patients often present reduced or altered melatonin secretion. Melatonin normally acts as a modulator of pain, a stabilizer of vascular tone, and a regulator of sleep-wake cycle. When this modulation is impaired, the trigeminal system becomes more excitable, the pain threshold is lowered, and migraine attacks become more likely. Migraine can be seen as another expression of altered regulation along the trigeminal locus ceruleus pineal axis. This does not mean that the mouth causes migraine, but it suggests that oral functions, by modulating trigeminal input, may influence the threshold at which migraine emerges. And this opens interesting perspectives for the integrative and preventive approaches alongside conventional therapies. If we step back for a moment, we can see a common thread running through everything we discussed tonight. From oral function to trigeminal signaling to brainstem regulation to hormonal rhythm. Different clinical condition, but a shared regulatory axis. So, before we close, let me summarize the key messages I would like you to take home. Now we can answer to our first question. The mouth is not just a mouth, it is a central sensory and regulatory interface. The trigeminal nerve is not just a pain pathway, it is a key regulator of systemic balance. The locus ceruleus translates oral input into alertness and recovery. The trigeminal locus ceruleus pineal axis links mouth, brain, and hormones. Melatonin is more than sleep. It is rhythm, repair, and resilience. Scoliosis and migraine can be different expressions of the same dysregulation of this axis. Signal quality matters more than signal intensity. Order supports regulation. Chaos amplifies stress. When the mouth is in balance, the nervous system can find coherence again. Equilibriodontics acts beyond the tooth. It works on function, not only on structure. Equilibriodontics is a form of neurosensory regulation. Oral functions continuously modulate the nervous system through the trigeminal nerve. So the mouth is not an isolated structure. It is a place where the rhythm begins. By restoring balance in the mouth, we help the whole system remember how to regulate itself. One mouth, one nervous system, one regulatory axis. Thank you for your attention and for sharing this perspective with me. I would be very happy to meet you in person in Milan on March 7th for the Equilibriodontic Formation course. I hope to see you there.